Welcome to today's session of the course and art and history of English language and literature. In the continuous with the previous lecture, we began looking at the age of Wordsworth, that is the section general prose. We will talk about the general prose history on the time of the age of Wordsworth. General characteristics. An important feature in the history of prose literature during the age of Wordsworth was the rise of a modern review and magazine. First came the Edinburgh Review, established in 1802 by the Geoffrey Browne, Sidney Smith, and other prominent men of letters of the Whig Party. 7 years later, the Quarterly was started as a Tory counterblast. William Gifford was its first editor, and on his retirement in 1824 he was succeeded by his son-in-law Lockhart. These were followed by two important magazines, the range and the interests of which, as the name implied, were intended to be broader and more varied than was the case with the regular review. Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, a Tory monthly, launched in 1870 by Wilson, Lockhart and Hogg, and shortly afterwards as its rival the London magazine, which included among its early contributors Lamb, Hazlitt, Dick Quincy, who was also a Blackwood's man, Tom Hood, Alan Cunningham and Carlyle. Another well-known periodical of the same general type, Fraser's, was founded in 1830. Nearly all the men who are to be mentioned in this chapter were regular periodical writers, and some of them gave the whole of their time and energies to this practically new form of literature. It is well, therefore, to realize the influence which this form exerted upon the prose literature in general. 2 points may be emphasized. In the first place, it gave great encouragement to its writing, and for this reason we find that most of the prose writers of the time were essayists rather than makers of books. Secondly, it offered a fresh field for criticism, and especially for the criticism of contemporary literature. In this literature of criticism, considerable space was naturally devoted to the discussion of the respective principles and merits of the old school and the new, and thus the two groups, the conservative or classical and the radical or romantic. It should also be noted that fundamental changes now appear in the form and temper of prose, and that these changes are parallel with those which had come over us. We have seen how modern prose arose at the time of Restoration, and with what effect it was employed in the 18th century by masters like Addison and Goldsmith. Yet this prose was a characteristic product of its age. In its limitation as well as in its excellence, it had lucidity, grace and charm, but it was wanting in variety, warmth and color. Nor was it the short prose in which one could express strong passion or deep feeling. Now the Romantic movement brought with it strong passion and deep feeling and a love of variety, warmth and color. We shall not be surprised, therefore, to learn that many of the prose writers of the early 19th century discarded entirely the 18th century tradition and sought richer harmonies and greater complexity of structure. This new movement in prose, like corresponding movement in verse, was in part connected with the revival and interest in our pre-Augustan authors. As a matter of convenience, we may arrange our writers with whom we have to deal in three groups, taking first those who are chiefly associated with the two great Edinburgh periodically. Second, the London men who were largely, if not entirely, journalists and miscellaneous. And lastly, such writers as do not naturally fall under one or another of these two heads. The Edinburgh man Francis Jeffrey in 1773 to 1850, called by his admirers the archcritic and by his victims Judge Jeffrey, contributed some 200 articles to the Edinburgh, and may be regarded as the most influential thought not the greatest critic of his time on the whole, as our quotation in 1806 will have shown. He represents the conservative side in the criticism. He was not indeed consistently opposed to the of Augustan tradition, but his general influence was on the side of authority and against innovation. Today his criticism seems in general unsatisfactory. He lacked breadth and sympathy and flexibility of judgment. His object was not to interpret but to arraign and, if possible, to condemn. He was often brutal. He cared little for subject matter and fixed his attention on form and style, and he had no feeling for the large human aspect of literature. His chief co-adjutor Sidney Smith was an exceedingly clever clergyman who is now better known for his witticism than for his literature. He contributed some 65 articles to the Edinburgh and produced a considerable body of other work, including the brilliant satire on the Irish question, Peter Plumley's Letters. His writings labor under the advantage of having dealt for the most part with dead, abused and forgotten controversies. For this reason they are now little read, which is pity, for they are full of good things. Of the Black Woodsman, the most famous in his own day was John Wilson, better known under his pen name of Christopher North, a man of powerful physique, a wrestler and boxer, and a devotee of the prize ring. While he was professor of moral philosophy in the University of Edinburgh, he carried his high spirit and his boisterous energies into nearly everything he wrote. His output was enormous and comprised stories, poems, and a vast of magazine articles on all sorts of subjects. His best work is to be found in his Noctes Ambrosiana, or Nights at the Ambrose Tavern in Edinburgh, which appeared in Blackwood at irregular intervals and ran to 70 number in all. They are in the form of dialogues and are full of conviviality, reckless humor and dashing criticism of literature and politics. But their interests were largely local and temporary, and their broad Scotch makes it additionally difficult for the southern reader to appreciate them. In regard to prose style, Wilson was entirely with the Romantics. Though he wrote for the London magazine as well as for Blackwood, we may here find place for a personal friend of Wilson and a man of far greater importance in literature, Thomas de Quincey. He too was essentially a magazinist, and the 17 volume of his collected work consists mainly of essay on a large variety of subjects. His writing is often marred by glaring defects. He had a habit of abusing his extraordinary learning and of sinking thereby into obscurity and pedantry. In argument, while wonderfully subtle, he was frequently captious and trivial, and he continually indulged in huge unwieldy digressions. His merit, however, are equally striking. His style at its best is marvelously rich and gorgeously rhetorical, and he remains one of our chief masters of romantic impassioned prose. He has great powers of narrative and description, as in his history of Joan of Arc and the wonderful English mail coach and dream fugue. He achieved remarkable success in combining grim humor with the horrible in his Murder, considered as one of the fine art, a piece of sustained irony which would have delighted Swift. But the will always be best remembered by his strangely fascinating autobiographical writings, especially the Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which may be classed among the finest things in our literature of personal experience. John Gibson Lockhart is like De Quincey, a connecting link between Edinburgh and London, for he was long one of the mainstay of Blackwood, while from 1826 to within a few months of his death he was editor of Quarterly, Though closely associated with Wilson, he was a man of very different temper and style of writing, for he was reserved, keen, incisive, and caustic. He produced much miscellaneous work, including 4 novels, a volume of Sprit Spanish ballads, and admirable Life of Burns, and his principal title to fame, however, he is magnificent Life of Scott, whose daughter Sophia he married in 1820. His position as a critic is interesting. Like many other men in that period of transition in literary taste, he was partly of the older and partly of new. He was romantic and with Scott, and sympathized with Wordsworth, but the work of the younger generation of Shelley, Keats, and Tennyson at the outset of his career aroused his hostility. The ascription to him of the authorship of the infamous Blackwood attack on Keats rests indeed of insufficient evidence, but it is certain that he wrote the almost equally savage criticism in the Quarterly of Tennyson's 1833 volume. His nickname of the Scorpion points to his special gift of sarcasm, which he often used with deadly effect. The London Man. First among these in our affections is Charles Lamb, one of the best beloved of English authors, whose memory, as Southey said, will retain its fragrance as long as best spice spended on the furrows. In nearly all his work, and preeminently in the most widely known portion of it, the ever delightful essays of Elia, Lamb is a much an egotist and Montaigne, and a substance of what he writes is almost wholly drawn from himself, his experience, reminiscence, like, dislike, whims, and prejudices. But we never complain of this, for he can angers language. It is man Charles Lamb that constitutes the charm of his writing words. He was a master of humorous and pathos, both of which, and more particularly the peculiar way in which he combined them, are so entirely personal to him, and we can compare them with nothing else in literature, and have even to coin the epithet lambis in order to suggest their qualities. On the critical side, his influence was strong in the development of romanticism, and especially of the kind of romanticism which was retrospective in character and largely nourished itself on the literature of the pre-Augustan age. All his sympathies were with his early literature, and the bent of his mind and the direction of his taste are shown in his Elizabethan tragedy, John Woodville, in his familiar tales from Shakespeare, and in specimens of English dramatic poets who wrote about the time of Shakespeare, a work which did much to spread the knowledge of our older English playwrights. His style, though like everything else about him, absolutely his own, he is flavored by constant contact with his favorite writers Burton, Fuller, and Sir Thomas Browne. He even said in his whimsical way that he wrote neither for the present nor for the future, but for antiquity. In Lamb's contemporary William Hazlitt, we have a capital illustration of the manner in which, as we have seen, the popularity of magazines turned literature into the channel of journalism. Though in his case we have to reckon also with the parallel growth of the influence of the lecture platform. Though irascible, petulant, full of crotchets and intense personal prejudices, Hazlitt was by far the best equipped and the most satisfactory critic of his day, and his fine catholicity and feeling for what is good wherever it is found enabled him to do justice to the romantic school of the one hand without being unjust to the Augustan on the other. His best criticism is contained in 4 collections of lectures or essays: Character of Shakespeare's play, the English poets, the English comic writers, and the dramatic literature of the age of Elizabeth. He has been called the critic's critic. and his insight, discrimination, and sureness of taste and touch go far to justify the title. Nonetheless, we must not forget that though the best of his kind, his criticism is marked by many of the limitations of his time. It makes no attempt to rise above the critic's personal judgment of his subject, to connect the author in question with the life and spirit of his age, as to interpret literature is that larger historical way of which something was said in the opening chapter of this little book. Leigh Hunt, who has already been mentioned as a poet, may also be included here among the periodical prose writers, for though he was a good deal of a bookmaker as well as lacked the power of sustained effort, and his books are therefore in the main composed of fragmentary material. His manner and style bear the unmistakable impress of his own easy-going, irresponsible nature and butterfly quality of his genius, and his personal charm. He had to live by his pen, and much of his work was done too fast, but his essay, with their quick wit and abundant fancy, are always readable, and his love of literature was honest and deep. As a critic, though he ranks below Hazlitt and Lamb, he holds a distinctive place among the men of his time. His taste was very elective, and the breadth of his sympathies is a pleasant feature of his criticism, but on the whole his tendency was toward romanticism. The most popular of all his books is his delightful written by autobiography, which Carlyle, who was not easy to satisfy in such a matter, called a pious, ingenious, altogether human and worthy book. Other prose writers of the period prominent among these at standing entirely apart from every set of and group was William Cobbett, political reformer, journalist, pamphleteer, and maker of many books. A coarse, vigorous, independent man, Cobbett was one of the most striking personality and one of the most widely influential writers of his age, though little of his voluminous work comes under the head of general literature. Perhaps his most characteristic book, and the one which has the most permanent interest in his ruler rights, his English grammar, is probably unique among grammars because it is thoroughly entertaining as a prose writer. He belongs to the race of Bunyan, Defoe, and Swift. He is vernacular, strong, simple, and clear. He evidently put into practice his own principle that a writer should always take the first word that comes to him, and this is sure to be the word which must most fully convey his meaning. This theory served him extremely well, but one would hesitate to apply it generally. An antithesis to Cobbett is almost every conceivable particular is presented by Landor, whose poetry has already been referred to. As Cobbett is one of our best vernacular and colloquial writer, and as De Quincey is one of our chief master of romantic prose, so Landor is unsurpassed in the severe sententious sculpturesque style. His principal prose work, The Imaginary Conversation, are dialogues between great characters of the past. Their composition extended over many years, and there are some of 150 of them in all. They cover a wide range of subjects in life and literature. Some are purely dramatic, others are reflective and philosophical. It has been well said of him that he was not a great thinker but a man of great thoughts. Besides these conservations, Landor produced 3 other works of a somewhat similar character: the citation of William Shakespeare, Pericles, and Aspasia, a tale of golden age of Athens told in letters, and a Pentameron, a serious dialogue between the Petrarch and Boccaccio, especially noteworthy for their fine criticism of Dante. Southey was industrious as a prose writer as he was as a poet, and as a whole his prose has won better than his verse. His masterpiece is the admirable Life of Nelson. On the other hand, Coleridge's prose is as fragmentary as his was. His criticism was, however, always suggestive and stimulating, and it exercised a profound influence in the establishment of the Romantic principle. In literature, his Biographia Literaria is rambling and unequal, and its style is in general poor, but it contains many pages of such subtle, analytical and interpretative power that they are enough by themselves to give him high standing among English writers on the theory of poetry. This chapter could be extended considerably by the inclusion of the many writers who during the period did excellent work in history and philosophy. But this is not the place to discuss the value of their contribution to the literature of their special subject, and no useful purpose would be served by a mere catalogue of the names of the writer. So with this we begin to wind up today's lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to see you in next class. Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe.